So what is the purpose of this budget? Now, to understand the purpose of this budget, we have to begin to examine the role of the International Monetary Fund. Now, the role of the International Monetary Fund and its counterpart, the World Bank, is not to help any country to develop. That is not the role of the IMF. It is not the role of the World Bank. The World Bank and the IMF are not concerned about whether you solve the unemployment problem in your country or not. They are not concerned about whether you increase access to social services or not. They are not concerned about whether there are potholes on your intercity roads or not, and so on. Their principal objective is to ensure the sanctity of Western financial institutions, to make sure that Western financial institutions do not collapse. So when they intervene in order to ensure that loans acquired from Western financial institutions will be paid back. Finished. Nothing more. So those of us who are either in the NDC or in the NPP and so on, who have this notion that the IMF can come in to help us to develop or to solve our problems and so on, we are living in cuckoo's land. It will never happen. You understand? So what do? They come in and they instruct you to freeze employment in the public sector. When they ask you to freeze employment in the public sector, what basically are they doing? What they are simply doing is that resources which should have gone into engaging labor and so on are set aside in order to help you balance your economy or balance your account so that you can pay your debt. One key example was Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire. The West knew that Mobutu Sese Seko could not pay the monies he was borrowing, and yet they kept on giving him monies, giving him loans, huge loans and so on. Why? Because Zaire under Mobutu was the bastion against the spread of socialism, or what the West called communism at the time. Okay? So they needed to make sure that he did not collapse. And yet they are beginning to think. Thinking is not the preserve of academics. Everybody thinks. And if you make facts available to people, people can think. You understand? So as far as I'm concerned, we are in a disaster. And we are heading towards greater disaster. Simply because our leaders have refused to think. Simply because we have not taken the option of making our own decisions on the basis of our own reality.
Whenever I say my PENDREAM TV there, I see them yopo.
You were till for a PENDREAM TV in Pacho. When you say the news not off from an eddy bro. News ya Obabeti in Pacho, so what didn't want to Trebia and so what didn't Trefa. News be I present your platform with you for your voice note not for sending it. I was 0277 128 777. The debate 2 PENDREAM FM so Magana phone in Ationka. Young court Nenko T and a story eddy bro.
Mr. Pratt.
Well, first of all, I'd like to get the small things out of the way.
Okay.
They are really small things, but for the purpose of the historical record and so on, it's important to state them. And my brother Bernard Mona, there's no interchange in Ghana which is named after Jacob Bilamte. No, none whatsoever. There's an interchange in Ghana which is named after Obeche Bilamte, but it is not Jake. Okay. It is named after Jake's father, who performed disastrously when he contested Nkrumah in the Odududu constituency. Indeed, it is named after somebody who Justice Akuffo Addo described as a terrorist. It's important to note that. Now, secondly, I think it's important for us to recognize that Parliament is a house of records, or sometimes it's described as a house of records. It is also sometimes described as a house of law. regulations, and tradition. So all of the things that happen in Parliament, and fortunately for us, ABA Fuseni is here, all the things that happen in Parliament follow clearly defined procedures. Procedures arrived at either through tradition, repeated practice, or law, which sometimes is governed by the standing orders and so on. Clearly, House of Records, House of Law, House of Regulations, and tradition. Now, with regards to what happened in Parliament, there was no deviation from the standing orders. There was no deviation from tradition, and so on. So it could not have been an act of conspiracy. I fail to see how anybody can read conspiracy into what happened in Parliament. There was no conspiracy. Now, I think it followed tradition and also followed the standing orders. And what is the tradition? The tradition is that when there's a voice vote, any speaker makes 3 pronouncements. The first pronouncement that a speaker makes is that I think the so-and-so has it, And he pauses deliberately. The purpose of pausing is to allow for challenges. He does so the second time and also allows for challenges. If there are no challenges, then he makes a decision. Which decision is that the eyes have it or the nose have it. You understand? Clear. That is the practice. And that is the practice which was followed by the sitting Speaker of Parliament. I don't see any conspiracy in what happened in Parliament. Absolutely no conspiracy. You understand? I'm intrigued by some of the things that happened in Parliament that day. And what happened in Parliament that day, simply put, indicates that the so-called majority, and I've never accepted that there's a majority in Parliament, but the so-called majority came to the conclusion that it did not have the numbers. And because it came to the conclusion that it did not have the numbers, like a little schoolboy whose father had bought him a football and had brought the football to the playing field, they decided to run away with the football. Now, if the Speaker called for a head count and they had the majority on their side, there was no way a head count would have reduced their majority. If the Speaker called for a division and they still had the majority on their side, there was no way that a division could have reduced their majority. No way, absolutely no way at all. So how come that they absconded? Now, I've listened to them very carefully. The official position is that they have 138 members of Parliament and that the opposition or the minority has 137. They are telling us that by their count, 5 members of the minority were not in the House. By their count. Now that reduces the minority side to 132. Okay? Now for the minority to be able to carry the day, given the scenario that they paint and so on, it means that 6 people had to be absent from their side. By all the calculations that they had made, it was clear that 6 were not absent. So what was the real fear? And the real fear can be explained in terms of developments in the House over the last 2 years or more. One, it's important to recognize that even with their so-called majority, and when all of them were present in the House, Right Honorable Alban Sumani Bagui was elected as Speaker. That's a very important, signpost. Okay? Now, how could that have happened? That could only have happened if there were dissensions from their numbers. Okay? Now, the other indicator that for me is interesting is the fact that today all of us know that if you go to Parliament, the vast majority of the so-called majority has no confidence in the finance minister. And it's been expressed. They've expressed it openly and so on. Now, if you come to the minority, the vast majority of the minority also has no confidence in the finance minister. Now, it is only a miracle which would explain why the finance minister is still at post. Perhaps extreme partisanship and total disregard for facts and reality is what makes it possible for the finance minister to stay at post. Not just to stay at post, but to have the courage to present a budget, to this parliament. So clearly, my conclusion is that the so-called majority ran away from parliament because they sense defeat. That is the only way to explain what had happened in parliament. Now, there have been discussions about the merits of this budget, what this budget is intended to do and not to do, and so on. Again, I think it's a very simple and straightforward matter. Anybody who has been reading the staff level agreement between the government of Ghana and the International Monetary Fund could easily have predicted this budget. This budget essentially is an IMF budget. And it follows everything in the staff level agreement reached with the government of Ghana by the IMF. So there's nothing in this budget which is surprising. It was predictable, it was clear, and so on. So what is the purpose of this budget? Now, to understand the purpose of this budget, we have to begin to examine the role of the International Monetary Fund. Now, the role of the International Monetary Fund and its counterpart, the World Bank, is not to help any country to develop. That is not the role of the IMF. It is not the role of the World Bank. The World Bank and the IMF are not concerned about whether you solve the unemployment problem in your country or not. They are not concerned about whether you increase access to social services or not. They are not concerned about whether there are potholes on your intercity roads or not, and so on. Their principal objective is to ensure the sanctity of Western financial institutions, to make sure that Western financial institutions do not collapse. So when they intervene in order to ensure that loans acquired from Western financial institutions will be paid back. Finished. Nothing more. So those of us who are either in the NDC or in the NPP and so on, who have this notion that the IMF can come in to help us to develop or to solve our problems and so on, we are living in cuckoo's land. It will never happen. You understand? So what do? They come in and they instruct you to freeze employment in the public sector. When they ask you to freeze employment in the public sector, what basically are they doing? What they are simply doing is that resources which should have gone into engaging labor and so on are set aside in order to help you balance your economy or balance your account so that you can pay your debts. When they come in and they ask you to freeze access to social services, it's again about conserving resources which will then be used to pay the loans. So we must understand that very clearly. It's not about our development. It's about our ability to pay loans. Now, there's even a question as to whether we should pay loans or not pay loans. And so on. And this has a long history, dating back to the early 1970s, when Commandant Fidel Castro actually urged third world countries not to pay their loans. And he urged third world countries not to pay their loans simply because the loans were unpayable. And that if third world countries continue to pay those loans, they would not be able to accelerate the pace of their development. That was one reason. Now, the other reason why people like Fidel and others asked us not to pay these loans was simply the fact that these loans have served as foreign policy instruments for the West. And he did not see why countries like Ghana should be paying for the foreign policy interest of the West. One key example was Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire. The West knew that Mobutu Sese Seko could not pay the monies he was borrowing. And yet they kept on giving him monies, giving him loans, huge loans and so on. Why? Because Zaire under Mobutu was the bastion against the spread of socialism, or what the West called communism at the time. Okay? So they needed to make sure that he did not collapse. So they kept pumping resources, loans and so on to Zaire. Now, why should the people of Zaire pay for the foreign policy interest of the United States of America or Britain or Germany? So on that basis, there's no moral grounds for repaying these loans. These loans were unpayable. It was unconscionable to pay these loans. Now, there's a third reason why advocates around the world insisted that these loans should not be paid. And the third reason simply is that our economies, the entire economies, have been run since the days of the transatlantic slave trade to today to benefit the multinational corporations in the colonial metropolis. So as we scream under the burden of loans, as we scream under economic mismanagement and so on, those companies are making humongous profits. So there's a certain symbiotic relationship between our level of indebtedness and the richness of the multinational corporations in the colonial metropolis. If they siphon our resources into their bank accounts and become very, very rich, and we become very, very poor on indebtedness, what is the moral basis for us paying these loans? There's no moral basis for us paying these loans, and so on. Now, I like to look at this budget, from one particular angle. This budget, what does it change? Does this budget move us from a neo-colonial economy, neo-colonial dependent economy, to the building of a self-reliant national economy? No, it doesn't. The economic policy of this government, as expressed in the budget, clearly keeps us on the path of neoliberalism, clearly keeps us on the path, of capitalist development and so on. So in terms of paradigm, there's no paradigm shift. Now, if you hear all the criticisms that are being made against the government, at least the criticisms that I've heard, I haven't heard anybody raise the issue, raise the fundamental issue of the direction of the national economy. Taxes are too high. GDP is this. You understand? Inflation is high and so on. Yes, you can reduce inflation within the paradigm of a neoliberal economy. Reducing inflation we can still reduce inflation and stay in that paradigm. You can improve your GDP and still stay in that paradigm and so on. Now, for me, one of the issues that we need to address is the inequality that is bestowed on us by the pursuit of neoliberal economics. The inequality. We must address the inequality. What are we doing in our country to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots? It's an essential question. And it's not addressed simply by looking at the burden of debt. It is not addressed by looking at the rate of inflation. It is not addressed by looking at GDP growth and so on. Inequality in our system can continue to exist whether we improve GDP or we don't, and so on. And for me, that is the critical question. What is it that we are doing in order to build a self-reliant economy within the ambit, you know, of Pan-Africanism and so on? That's the critical question. Now, I like many times to go back, and go back very far. Go back to 1945. And I go back to 1945 because it was in 1945 that the blueprint for the liberation of Africa from colonialism and neo-colonialism was clearly established. And since 1945, there's been no other blueprint for that liberation. And that blueprint was established, by the 5th Pan-African Congress, which took place in Manchester. The 5th Pan-African Congress, which had Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, you know, as secretary, decided that Africa had a clear problem. And one of the clearest problems we had at that time was national liberation. How to break free from the colonial yoke. How to make sure that our people retain the right to choose their own leaders, to choose their type of government, and so on. That was key. The other issue had to do with the enormous resources of Africa. You understand? I mean, since then, up to today, Africa has so much resources. Africa is the continent, the richest continent in the world. Something must explain our poverty in the face of these riches. We are so very rich. Richest in the world. Indeed, Africa has close to 60% of the arable land in the world. And we are complaining that war in Ukraine and so on has affected our food supply. How can that be? You understand? So the 1945 Congress actually decided that the roadmap to the liberation of Africa would have to include measures which place the resources of Africans in African hands. You understand? Simply put, Africans ought to own their own resources. And that when we own our own resources, these resources need to be exploited for the benefit of the African people. And that at the third phase, what we needed to do was to reunite Africa, smash the existing boundaries between African countries, and build the United States of Africa, and so on. So these were the clear stages which were set for us. So I look at national budgets, I look at national policies and so on within this frame, and we are failing miserably. We are failing miserably to realize the dreams of our founding fathers. It is not about the GDP. It is not about the per capita income. It is not about the rate of inflation. It goes beyond that. What are we doing, first of all, to ensure that we choose our own destiny, we choose our own path of development? What are we doing to ensure that we own our own resources and that these resources are exploited for the benefit of our people and so on? Now, over the last couple of weeks, something very significant has happened in West Africa. And I don't hear it discussed a lot, and it worries me. A couple of months ago, indeed 5 months ago, in Niger, a West African country, was counted amongst the poorest, the 3 poorest countries in the world. 3 poorest countries in the world. Niger, only 5 months ago. Within a period of 4 months, Niger has become the fastest growing economy in the world. And this is phenomenal. Phenomenal. So we've got to be asking ourselves, what did Niger do in 4 months? For it to move from one of the 3 poorest countries in the world to the fastest growing economy in the world. What happened? And this must present for us important lessons. As an observer, All that Niger has done is to take control of its natural resources. That's all. And taking control of its natural resources has pushed it from one of the 3 poorest countries in the world to the fastest growing economy in the world, just by taking control of its resources. Of course, we can also look at the Botswana example. Botswana didn't do anything extraordinary. What did they do? They decided that their diamonds should be marketed in Botswana, not in Antwerp. And the dividend from that has been huge and so on. So it's important for us to learn important lessons. Now, it's within this context that the new agreement we have reached on the extraction of our lithium resources should be viewed. We should stop counting inflation and counting GDP and so on, and begin to ask questions about the new agreement for the exploitation of our new, lithium resources. Who benefits? Who controls it? And so on. That is learning the important lessons of Niger. You understand? Why? If you go to Niger today, Niger is not governed by any wonderful people who went to school in Harvard and so on. Niger is being governed by the lieutenant colonels and generals, plenty of which we have here. And yet, they are making substantial progress. You understand? I can bet my bottom dollar that if you went to Niger, you may not find anybody who went to school in Harvard in the government. And even if you find, there may not be more than 1, 2, or 3. And yet they are beginning to think. Thinking is not the preserve of academics. Everybody thinks. And if you make facts available to people, people can think. You understand? So as far as I'm concerned, we are in a disaster, and we are heading towards greater disaster, simply because our leaders have refused to think. Simply because we have not taken the option of making our own decisions on the basis of our own reality. Look, a number of things have happened since the last budget, which must be very significant for us. Why do you think that the IMF has appointed a supervisor sitting in the Bank of Ghana? Why do you think so? And we are not complaining about that. We are looking at GDP and so on. Meanwhile, the IMF has a supervisor sitting on top of the governor of Bank of Ghana. He sees everything feature before it is implemented. Why? Because the IMF cannot trust that system to pursue its agenda. And in order to make sure that that agenda is being pursued, they have appointed somebody to sit in that bank to look at everything and to make sure that we remain on the path of neoliberalism. That should be something that we need to look at very closely. And it doesn't end there. The Washington administration has actually appointed somebody they call an advisor and superimposed him in the Ministry of Finance. Joe Biden's representative is sitting in the Ministry of Finance. He sees everything before he goes out. Why has it become necessary for the United States of America to become the final arbiter when it comes to decisions about our economy? Why? Why? That advisor they brought from the United States of America, is he more knowledgeable than the economists we have in our country? Why? All of our universities have economic departments. You have so many professors in economics and so on. How come that our government has decided that Joe Biden's advisor should be sitting in the Ministry of Finance, watching everything and perhaps dictating everything? That is the core of our problem. We need to move out of this neoliberal agenda. We need to move to the stage where our people will control their resources and would ensure that their resources are exploited in their interest. Basic, finished. Now, my brother Bernard is not very confident about anything changing. And he has actually said that when Parliament meets again, the budget will be passed. I'm not so sure what gives him that confidence. Because there are so many trends which also indicate. He may be right, no problem, he may be right. But there are so many trends which indicate that this budget can be defeated. Especially if the so-called minority remains united. There are so many trends which indicate that this budget can be defeated. One, why? All of us know that Kennedy Akompreko was not in Parliament.
Yeah.
Why was he not in Parliament? I'm not able to explain. But why was he not in Parliament? Clearly, he has been clearly dissatisfied with the finance minister and how the economy has been run. He has been clearly been dissatisfied with what he calls the lies of his own political party and so on. He's not been in Parliament, maybe his protest. And I don't know, I can't say for sure whether he's indeed protesting. But if he's protesting, I think it will take a bulldozer to drag him from his house to Parliament to go and vote. That's true.
That's true.
Now, the forces which voted against the MPP's decision to present Professor Michael Kwe as Speaker against Abin Bagbin, are they dead? Are they still not there in the so-called majority? How are those forces likely to behave? I don't know. The last time the majority won a vote in similar circumstances, they actually, according to the stories that they themselves told, they had to hire private jets to fly people from the United States of America and so on. Are they able to do that next time round and so on? So there are so many imponderables. Bernard may be right that in the final analysis, the budget will be approved. But it is also likely that the budget can be disapproved if you look at all the factors on the ground. There is some information that I have which I have not been able to disclose over a long period of time, but I'm tempted to disclose today. And I would dare Alhaji ABF Seni to challenge that. Yes. The last budget was approved.
Why are you looking for lion? Is that go and arrest? That's not how. A lion with my bare hands. Is that fair? Not the man. That's not the. Now, when the man has even thrown me the ring of lions, they say you are daring me to. I'm going to catch a lion with my bare hands.
No, that's not what I'm just saying.
This one.
Disagree with me, and then let's see what happens.
Meanwhile, you're calling me a friend, a brother. And you want me to go and catch a hungry lion with my bare hands?
My brother, I mean, if you know the reasons why the last budget was not rigorously fought by the National Democratic Congress, you will weep. Amongst them, one of the arguments which was made was that if the budget is not approved, it will lead to extreme hardship. Workers will not be paid and so on. And the likelihood of a coup d'etat will be greater. So approve the budget. Let's wait for 2024 so we can win the elections. Because if there's a coup d'etat, we cannot win the elections. I lie. If I lie, tell me and then I will stop.
You see, we are all minded to protect the democratic process. Oh, that's part of. So you agree?
No, I'm not.
No, I'm not saying that I agree. I'm just making
An explanation of what even we all agree, including himself.
So that's the kind of thinking. You have an opposition who doesn't want to disrupt anything for fear that there's likely to be a coup d'etat. The opposition is more afraid of a coup d'etat than even the government. That's the situation in which we are. So the opposition argues that it should not behave in ways which would disrupt things, which will make a coup d'etat possible. Oh, Master, I will stop here.
Thank you very much.
But have you seen this kind of opposition anywhere in the world? Only in Ghana. The opposition who says that don't do anything which will disrupt what is happening.
But see, hope is coming. Mahama is coming.
Exactly.
There's hope that will fix.
Oh yes.
The reason.
Oh yes.
That you not disrupt the things.
Hope is coming. Unlike this hopelessly unexpected government.
We are waiting for my
Hope is coming. President Mahama will fix it.
Inshallah.
So you know, I cannot fully answer your question to your satisfaction, but I can tell you that.
Let us enjoy peace until he comes.
I won't push any further.
I beg you.
But if you continue making this
let's enjoy the
statement,
peace.
you will force me.
No, I will not continue. I'm just saying this and I'll stop here. I have no intention to provoke.
Let me just do a few messages.
Story a OTCC no. A platform I friend PENDREAM TV. Aha, and I uti story no. Na o feedback we here empa story our tie no. Any story be our platform ne so be our tie o pese o my feedback no. Fafa WhatsApp message or WhatsApp number 0277128777. Na ye be bo e wo PENDREAM FM Ghana for nyina ate won ka.
Dedi kama mamena PENDREAM TV ase. Na so far so good. Say open online portal e wo Ghana. Ah nipa share, nipa follow, nipa comment here. To my best of knowledge, without any biases, PENDREAM TV.